I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing parts much farther away. The Italian elections, but not only the politics of Italy, because frankly, throughout Europe, and you could argue in the United States, the centre cannot hold. Everywhere, people are rising up. Sometimes it takes a left form, more often a right form, but the centre, the status quo, the establishment in Europe and in the United States is under threat as possibly never before. The centre cannot hold because it has failed. It has failed people on the economic level, on the societal level, even on the foreign policy level, to which I'm sure in the course of this evening we will turn. I'm joined, as always, by an audience of distinguished experts, including a new Italian member of Parliament, and clerics and experts of all kinds. But there are enthusiastic amateurs too, like myself. The Italian election was, in retrospect, very easy to call. I actually did call it on my radio show with an expert from King's College in London, no less, very distinguished academic. I told him that the Five Star Movement were going to win the election. He laughed. Oh, how he laughed. They're not laughing now, because that Five Star Movement, a populist movement, neither left nor right, but populist, struck a chord with what public opinion was thinking and increasingly saying. They're neither left nor right. There are other parties that are unequivocally right. The League, formerly the Northern League, now the Italian League, is undoubtedly very right-wing. But nonetheless, their policy against neoliberal economics, mass immigration, and the problem of the refugees flooding in to Italy more than anywhere else, consequences, of course, of British and American and French and even Italian wars in North Africa and in the Middle East. The people aren't going to put up with it anymore. That was the message. It was the message less authentically expressed by Bunga Bunga man Berlusconi, who has reinvented himself, having formerly been the mouth of the European Union in Italian politics. He's now a very Eurosceptic, don't you know? But he couldn't become the Prime Minister. Indeed, he couldn't even stand for Parliament because he is forbidden by law to do so because he is a convicted criminal. But his party, nonetheless, did well. Not as well as their partners in La Liga, and neither did as well as the Five Star Movement. But if you put the votes of all three together, you have a very clear plurality of the Italian electorate. For someone my age, this is all quite stunning. I grew up in a period where the so-called Christian Democrats, representing the right, and the Communist Party of Italy, the PCI, were absolutely dominant, together entirely hegemonic in the Italian political system. Neither of them actually exists anymore, all in one lifetime. Both have been obliterated by the failures of their own terms of governance, in the case of the Christian Democrats, and in the case of the Communist Party, the PCI, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist idea, at least for a time. Now, Italy isn't the only place that this is happening. In the German parliament, the idiot Social Democrats, that's the Labour equivalent in Germany, has just voted to form a coalition government with the Margaret Thatcher of German politics, Angela Merkel. Imagine a coalition between Jeremy Corbyn and Angela Merkel or Theresa May. It's grotesque, a double-headed beast. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything, when you consider that the official opposition in Germany is now, therefore, the Social Democrats having joined the government, the official opposition is the Alliance for Deutschland, AfD, which is, yes, you guessed it, another populist, quite right-wing party. People say, what about Macron in France? Well, in the first ballot, Macron almost didn't get through to the second round. If you add the votes of Mr. Mélenchon on the left and Madame Le Pen on the right together, they came quite close, actually, to being the two candidates in the runoff. In Britain, things are slightly different. You could say that Jeremy Corbyn, a man of the left, has taken the Labour Party in a populist direction. Not quite populist enough, in my opinion, but you could say that that's one of the reasons why he alone, of all the Social Democrats in Europe, continues to thrive. In Austria, the populist far right is in control of the country. Imagine, Austria, far right. What could possibly go wrong? So, one thing is for sure, everything is changing. Now, we have some real experts with us this evening, so enough from me. The man with the microphone I recognize. He's one of Britain's hottest young journalistic talents. From a magazine called Westmonster, which I suppose you could say, yes, Westmonster. Not to be confused with the monster that is Westminster, the seat of the British Parliament. Patrick Christie's and his magazine could be said to be the voice of populism in Britain. They're certainly trying to corner that market. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, George. Yeah, well, basically, I think that Euroscepticism is obviously on the rise across Europe, and populism is massively tied into that. People all over the continent, I think, are looking to reclaim some national sovereignty. I think they want control of their borders, their money, their legal systems, and frankly, a lot of their governments, their very Europhile governments, have not been offering them that for a long time. And as a result, they've seen, or they believe they've seen, kind of their economies disintegrate, or kind of national happiness and national integrity be dissolved, and people are moving right across the continent, as we've seen, to bring that back. It's a monumental threat for Europe, not least because a huge amount of this is being pushed forward by the youth vote. In Italy, 65% of the young people voted for the Eurosceptic parties. They are obviously the voters for generations to come.
How are you defining young?
I think it's under 25s. So obviously that's potentially quite a massive issue for the European Union, because if they are Eurosceptic and they presumably have several more generations to vote, then that is a big problem. So I think what we're seeing here now is more of a reclamation for people of their national sovereignty and national integrity, because when they look at Brussels, they look at it and they think, well, you've got unelected fat cats there kind of leading the show. You've got an ECJ, an overarching legal system that doesn't prioritise national sovereignty whatsoever or national law. And frankly, they've made some bad decisions. They don't believe they're being governed that well by Brussels. And so you are seeing a reaction to that, and that is this nationalism, I suppose.
Yes. Now, in the Italian case, it's unique. The European Union actually picked and imposed a prime minister on Italy. Where is he now? I've even forgotten his name. But they wouldn't accept any other outcome than this man that they had picked. So the EU was almost exercising direct rule over the Italian people.
Yeah.
How did that go?
Well, it's gone down very badly, hasn't it, really? I mean, I think this is it. I think that there's a reaction now, especially maybe from the youth, but from people in general, against this perceived arrogance from Brussels and this perceived arrogance of the whole EU superstate. You know, they are sick of things being enforced upon them. People don't like that. People revolt against that. And that's why we've seen this big upsurge in Italy. And also, as well, crucially in Italy, I think the Five Star Movement started out as a blog, I think, online, for example.
Tell us about the Five Star.
Well, yeah, they started out as a blog online. One of their main leaders, I suppose, a guy called Beppe Grillo, who used to be a stand-up comedian, which is slightly ironic, I suppose, especially if you're on the left.
There's quite a few politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I think the crucial thing with the Five Star Movement and some of the other ones, the Liga, is that they've not had a chance to betray the public yet. They've not had a chance to let them down or go back on promises because they've not been in power, you know. And people are looking at all the other options and thinking, well, hang on a minute, you lied to us about this, or you let us down on this. And also, I think people feel as well, they've got more of a direct say. It's their man, isn't it, this person that they've seen from writing a blog all the way through, whereas the people that are, you know, your classic political elite, as it were, your establishment figures, they're not like the people, are they? They're not like us, and so people are less likely to vote for them. So I think that's why we're seeing a bit of what's happening there in Italy.
And finally, this is not just happening on the right, is it? In Portugal, for example, the people voted to have a left-wing government, and the European Commission told the Portuguese president that they would not accept the Communist Party and other leftist forces which were hostile to the European Union. The EU would not accept them in the government.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think this is it, isn't it? It's interesting that right across Europe now, the centre figures are going, whether it's on the left or the right now, this is where the popularity is. People like someone with a definitive identity. I think that's why Jeremy Corbyn's done quite well with insurgents power within the Labour Party. People want someone they can actually pin to the mast and go, he stands, or she stands for this, this and this. We're done with the days of David Cameron, who's the best PR man this country's ever produced. He's not a politician. I couldn't tell you really what he's done for. I'm not sure he could, actually. And so really now people like someone who you can pin to the mast on specific issues. People want someone they can get behind and unite behind. And even if you disagree with that, you respect them because you know where they stand. And I think that's what we're seeing now over Europe. And actually, I think that's probably for the best, personally.
Now, we have a centrist member of Parliament with us. Massimo, why don't you take the microphone next? Was my analysis of the Italian political scene accurate in your view?
I think I disagree on many things you said, George, if I have to be honest.
I want you to be as honest as possible.
Of course. And
this program is called Kalima Horra, which means free word.
Fantastic. And thank you for the invitation, and to all of you and your guests. No, the main point is, if I may, my opinion is I don't think the young people of the South who voted against the establishment or the mainstream parties, I don't think that theme of the European Union was the dominant one. An example is that Five Star itself, they changed their position on the euro during the campaign. It's a marginal one. I don't think it was central. That's the first point.
They did well, though, didn't they? The Five Star movement in the South swept the board.
Absolutely. That's the tragedy for my party. I belong to the Italian Democratic Party. And of course, we lost connection, the sentimental connection with the young people in the South. Totally. We are a divided country. And that's the first political battle for us, is to reconnect with them. That's absolutely true. Also, I disagree with another point. Nobody has won the elections. I mean, of course, Five Star, 33%, they are the first party, but nobody is really able to form a government unless there is an alliance with the right wing.
That's always the case in Italy, of course.
Indeed, unfortunately, due to our parliamentary republic system. The other point I wanted to make is I accept the European Union has got a lot of problems, especially the euro. I mean, of course, we are the mostly pro-European party in Italy, and we see the Union as an anchor to say, for the future. But of course, if the European Union stays the shape it is and the form it has, it will not survive the next crisis. So we want a more social Europe, like, for example, the introduction of a European employment mechanism. We want a more human Europe, meaning, for example, to modify the Treaty of Dublin. And we want a more political Europe. And so, for example, the direct election of the President of the Commission by the European citizens. So we want a reform, but we think we can do much more within than from outside.
Of course, as I always say, if my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle. These things that you want, none of them are going to happen. So tell us, I'm sorry to intrude on private grief, tell us how badly your party did do.
We did terribly. We got 18%. So if you compare to the European election where we got 40%, but to be honest, we should compare it to the previous national elections in 2013 where we got 25%. So we lost 7 points totally.
Just for the international viewers, explain how it is that you can be a member in the Italian Parliament representing voters in London. It's a wonderful thing, and you sound like a great MP to me.
Yes, of course. So we are 60 million Italians in Italy and 5 million Italians abroad. We have a big diaspora, which goes from, to 150 years ago. I'm sure you noticed in London we are a lot of us. So we elect our own MPs representing Italians living abroad. We elect 6 senators and 12 MPs, members of parliament. Of these 12, 5 in Europe. So my constituency goes from Portugal to Vladivostok in Russia, and I represent...
I'd love to have that.
It's very easy to navigate. So I'm one of the 5 MPs elected in the Italian parliament by the Italians abroad.
Okay. Father, Reverend Frank Gelli, you are, of course, a British resident, but Italian. Did I sum up the Italian scene reasonably accurately or not?
You did, George. You're always brilliant with your analysis. I wanted to, for a moment, to cast a light on the dark side of these elections, which is the success of the League, of a xenophobic League, and some of the far right, which is also in coalition, showing coalition with the League, because the rhetoric of against immigration and immigrants, which my colleague, indeed fellow Italian, has just highlighted, was an important factor, not indeed unlike in this country Brexit. Xenophobia lay a lot behind it. But the paradox is this. See, these far-right, extreme right groups, and of course, let's not forget we got the extreme center around today, like in this country, so clamoring for war with Russia and so on. You can be extreme in the center as well. But these extreme far-right groups are all supposed to stand for family values, for conservative values, for children, having families, having children. Now, the paradox is that they are against immigrants. And let's not fool ourselves. That means Muslims, largely Muslims, because so many of these immigrants, desperate people, arriving, clamoring on the gates of Europe are Muslims. And so it's the fear of Islam, it's Islamophobia. But the paradox is that many of these Muslims are actually quite conservative in terms of family values. So why is it when Mr. Wilders complains of course, in Holland, maybe the Pope of all Islamophobes, says that these people are actually undermining building mosques, not enough churches. Well, are the Muslims stopping Christians from going to church? I've not found any Muslim with a turban standing at the gate of my parish saying, you can't come in, go to a mosque. So this absurd rhetoric against Islam from a point of view of parties which are actually meant to represent values which are very similar to conservative traditional Muslim values. So this is the incoherence, the contradiction of the far right, which is actually casts some doubt upon their own credentials, if I may say so.
It's also about colour, isn't it? You say that most of the immigrants arriving in Italy are Muslim. I don't know the numbers on that, but I do know that a very significant number of them don't look like you or me. They are darker than us and sometimes very dark in complexion indeed. So it's not just about religion, it's about otherness, difference, isn't it?
I mean, I had a girlfriend in my youthful days in Italy. She was from Calabria.
You sure you should be saying that, Father?
Well, like St. Augustine, he said, make me, make me
chaste,
perfect.
Make me chaste, but not
make
yet.
Me chaste. You can quote Augustine better than I do. Maybe you failed your vocation. I mean, her skin was actually darker than the skin of Meghan Markle. So Italians are not this absurdity of race. There is no Italian race. As I submit, there is no British race. There is a coalition. And so the whole argument, undeniably, there is, you can identify the other from outer signs far more directly. But let's not forget, Islam is not a race. There are Muslims in Bosnia, Muslims in Turkey who are whiter than many Englishmen.
It's a fascinating start, and there's much more to come. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London, but discussing Italy, but also the rest of Europe, where populism is on the march. Now, the distinguished professor from King's College that laughed at me on my radio show is not the distinguished professor from King's College, who would never dare to laugh at me because we're old friends. Dr. Foster, tell us your take as an academic on the outcome of the Italian elections.
Shortly after the Scottish independence referendum, I remember reading an article in The Spectator which began with the immortal lines, "Do you remember when politics was boring?" And for so long in the 2000s and the 1990s, this did seem to be the case. Let's look back to the early 1990s when we got two very popular books published, making very different predictions about the future in those heady, exciting days after the fall of the Soviet Union. The first one was Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, who predicted that now the Soviets were gone, we were all going to become neoliberal, capitalist, parliamentary republics, and we'd all dance and sing together in an eternity of peace and prosperity. At the same time, we got Samuel Huntington's thesis on the clash of civilizations, who argued that now that the Soviets were gone, we were going to return back to ethnic struggles and a clash of cultures, not a clash of economic ideologies. The current situation that we're seeing in Europe, in America, to a lesser extent but still visible in East Asia, I think is a fulfillment of Huntington's prediction that people have become deeply disillusioned with a political and economic system which they feel doesn't benefit them. In London, in Paris, in New York, of course people can feel part of a global cosmopolitan culture, but in Bradford, in Marseille, in Detroit, people feel that they've been abandoned by elites in the capitals, whether they are political or commercial or media elites, who look with scorn and distaste at the people of southern Italy, at the people of Brittany or of Southern Ireland. And so what we're seeing in Europe at the moment, well, what we're seeing around the world in the moment, is not a surprise because people are so dissatisfied with a centrist status quo. In an act of desperation, they're looking to parties which no longer fit on the left-right spectrum. They defy easy categorization. The Italian election in that regard is very similar to the election of Donald Trump or to the Brexit vote. Not something that's necessarily driven by racism or xenophobia, but something driven by a desperation. Not just at the international situation. Brexit was not just a vote against Brussels, it was also a vote against London. Donald Trump, he was elected not because the American people wanted an incompetent bigot, but because they wanted anyone who was different to...
They did get one, but that's not necessarily
what they did get one, but that's not the reason that they went for him. Of course, there's always going to be a small, hard core of very unpleasant people who will vote for political actions based on their own xenophobia, but that doesn't translate into tens, hundreds of millions of people across the Western world looking for an alternative scenario, whether it's Five Star, Liga, Geert Wilders or AFD. They're doing it out of a sense that they have been ignored, and with the resurgence of identity politics, they're finding their voice again. We could look at this in a similar way to Newtonian physics. In Newtonian physics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Over the last 20 years, the rise of a very vocal and well-organised left and its preoccupation, if you like, obsession with identity politics has ended up creating a more increasingly vocal right wing. Or, well, we would say right-wing, they might defy easy categorisation, who are also concerned, maybe obsessed with identity politics. The two are symbiotic. So the rise of the right is not an isolated phenomenon. It's something which we've been predicting since the mid-1990s and something which would be a natural outcome of the emergence of an identity-based left.
I wanted to test something that Reverend Gilly said which I strongly disagree with. The idea that being concerned about mass immigration makes you a xenophobe is, I think, belied by our own experience here in Britain, because EU immigration here is white immigration. I take the point in Italy it's not, but as Father Galloway said, there's no Italian race, neither is there a British race, but there is a Caucasian European race, and most of the EU immigrants here look like us. You couldn't tell whether you, frankly, were Polish or Slovakian or English or Scottish and so on. So I'm concerned that mass immigration myself, because it drives down wages, because it drives up rents, it places pressure on public services. Now, of course, going back to my auntie and her beard, of course, if we had a government that did things differently, that wouldn't be such a problem. But we don't have such a government doing things differently. So it is a problem. You're not a racist per se to be concerned about large flows of people coming ready to work for less, some cases much less, here, are you?
This is absolutely the case. We could look at, say, China, or no, a better example would be Japan, which has one of the lowest immigration levels in the world. Now, imagine if 1 million Europeans or 1 million Indonesians had tried to gain access to Japan, or even if 1 million Japanese had moved from Honshu to Hokkaido. The concerns would not be racial or ethnicist. They'd be concerned about massive pressure on infrastructure and resources. They'd be concerned about wages plummeting. So, yes, there can be a xenophobic, of course there's always going to be some element of a xenophobia behind opposition to mass immigration, but it's not the only factor. And this is something that we seem to have forgotten in this country, especially in the aftermath of Brexit, that it's now become the case of increasingly in media dialogue from my side, the remnants of the Remain campaign, anyone who dares to criticise Europe or mass migration for any reason is automatically branded worse than Nigel Farage. Now, any sort of immigration is going to have identity aspects to it. If we could go back to the Father's point that he made about family values being shared by the likes of Geert Wilders and conservative Muslims. I fundamentally disagree with this, because if we take something like family values, they don't mean the same in different cultures. So the family values of Northern Ireland are going to be very different to the family values of Yemen or the family values of South Korea. So we could see superficial similarities between different cultures. But those similarities are significantly less than the very visual, very symbolic, very everyday differences which divide people. So it's not a lot of opposition to migration across Europe, especially in the aftermath of the migration crisis. It's not based in racism. It's based in a genuine concern that one identity is being eroded at the expense of another.
What kind of identity?
This would be the Western...
Give Father Galloway the...
I think xenophobia is a fact. And if you talk about identity, then you've got to specify what you mean by identity. Is it people who look different? Is it people who have a turban? And in this country, people can't even tell the difference between a Sikh and a Muslim. There's a Sikh who stopped going to a club because wearing a kind of turban, people can't tell the difference between a Muslim turban and a Sikh turban. They're quite different. But there is a xenophobic element, fear, and also let's not forget it. If you are a country which has run a huge empire until not too many years ago, you have a superiority complex. George always said British people feel superior to foreigners. And he was no racist. He disapproved of that. But he knew, when he wrote the Burmese Days, he knew what it was like to lord it over the, what do you want to use? So we are sort of, hiding our head in the sand.
Well, look, in Burmese Days, which was, of course, based upon himself, the character Jim Florey, the colonial official, was actually Orwell. I think he had actually very dodgy views on race. But we can all argue about how we define identity. It's a bit like the camel. It's difficult to define, but easy to recognize. If in your street a significant number of people who don't, for example, speak your language,
English people don't talk to each other anyway.
so we wouldn't
In
know.
London,
So we
you
wouldn't
don't talk
know.
to your neighbours.
Let's. We had a rising star, hot journalist of the right. Let's take another rising star, hot journalist of the left, Matt Turner of Evolve Politics. Tell us your take.
Well, I think that one thing that has been neglected in the conversation about the five-star movement in particular is how it differs from a lot of different populist parties in Europe. You know, I think a lot of the kind of main figureheads of different populist parties, you look at Nigel Farage in UKIP, Le Pen in France, very, very strong leaders, very vocal leaders. It's about them. It's not necessarily about the movement that follows. The five-star movement is completely different. You know, I think the leaders kind of say it's not about me, it's about you. And I think that that's the key between kind of transcending left and right politics. It's about not being a political party, but being a movement. If you look at the internal party democracy in the five-star movement, they've tried to create like a new digital agora. You know, the agora being like an old ancient Greek debating forum where kind of deliberative democracy really did thrive. Now they've kind of harnessed social media, harnessed the internet, and created a true debating forum for their members to vote on issues, and all representatives in Parliament have to abide by that. And I think that's a really, really good step for other populist parties, you know, maybe Jeremy Corbyn's Labour or other populist parties on the left or the right to take if they are going to try and truly transcend party politics.
This is direct democracy, asking people en masse to say what stance the party should take on this or that.
Yes, yeah, no, exactly. And I think if you look at Labour, for example, the Parliamentary Labour Party have held Jeremy Corbyn hostage for the last 2 years. Now, if the members had their say, that wouldn't be the case. And that's a problem which the five-star movement don't have.
Well, yeah, they have quite a high attrition rate of elected members leaving or being expelled and so on, perhaps precisely for that reason. But you're right, if Labour had a direct democracy on whether we should be going to war with Russia right now, or we should be staying in NATO, or perhaps especially renewing Britain's nuclear weapons fleet, I think that Corbyn and people who think like him would probably win an overwhelming majority.
Absolutely, yeah, I really don't doubt that. You know, I think that that is the main thing that's held Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party back over the last year or two. It's been the fact that Jeremy Corbyn hasn't kind of been able to fully enact the will.
He's in office, but
of
not
the
in
party membership.
in power. Let me ask you something about this definition of left and right. It's undoubtedly changing, isn't it? As it happens, you and I agree on quite a lot of things. But I would never have been expected to agree with Patrick or he with me on anything. But in fact, we do agree on some quite important things. And thus, either I'm changing, he's changing, or the definition of left and right is changing. Let's take immigration. I have never, actually, so I haven't changed, I have never understood why encouraging mass immigration from poor countries to rich countries is a left-wing idea. It's the opposite of a left-wing idea. You're making the poor countries poorer and the rich countries richer. If all the qualified doctors of India or Slovakia all come and work in Britain, what do you do if you need medical attention in Slovakia or India?
Yeah, I remember talking with you about this during the Brexit referendum. I think that's because the kind of what is known as left has kind of changed over the last kind of 20 years or so. Yeah. I think if you look at, you know, now that would be a liberal point of view as opposed to a left view. And Tony Blair and a kind of centre-left Social Democrats have, you know, been called the left for the last 10, 20 years. And I think now you've seen the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and the populist left as opposed to kind of establishment neoliberal social democracy. I think you will see a slight change in the rhetoric on immigration, and it won't be the kind of rhetoric on immigration that is race-baiting or xenophobic, which you do kind of tend to see from the populist right, but it will be a genuine, honest discussion about what people in their communities really want.
And he may have started doing that in his speech to the Scottish Labour conference last weekend, when he used words that I just used about pressure on wages, public services, rents, and so on. Well, we'll hear the voice of the British people after this break. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, in London, talking about Italy. Now, we took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London. We asked people about Brexit, about populism, about the changes that are underway in Europe. Let's take a look.
What do you think about Brexit?
Oh, I don't do anything to do with that. I didn't even vote.
I think it's not a good thing, the Brexit, because I am from Europe, for example, and I think it's a good thing that the British people are in communication with all the European Union.
I'm a Portuguese, my wife, we are Portuguese, and we think that it's very important that for the future, to maintain the coherence of the European project, have Britain with us.
I took a class about the politics of the European Union, and from everything we studied, the Union was financially smart for some of the more Eastern countries, but for Britain it wasn't, because they were such ahead in the economy. They guided it so much, and when they left, it ruined the economy of the European Union. So I think for British citizens it makes a lot of sense, but for the people that were being helped, it doesn't. So they're upset.
How do you feel about Italy possibly leaving the EU?
I don't believe. I think Italy is always like that. There are always elections that transform everything, but the economy in Italy, it's very, very strong, and the Italians are more and are beyond the politicians.
Well, for Italy, which is a poorer country than what Britain is, I think it'll be a good thing.
I don't understand the idea that Italy wants to leave the European Union too, because all the European Union was founded to be all together. No, now I don't like all the terms, I leave. I don't like it.
No, I don't think it would be a smart move. I think that for the countries who rely on other countries more, that it makes more sense to stay in the Union and rely on each other with Erasmus and with all the other benefits that come with it, easy transportation, no problems at borders. It just makes it easier, I think, especially because Britain's a little farther out. It made a little bit more sense, but right in the heart of the continent, it would be harder to leave.
Well, I'd like to say that was the voice of the British public, though hardly anybody there was British, which tells you something, of course, a point that was made earlier by Dr. Foster, that in London, in Paris, in Rome, perhaps Rome, there is, if you like, a metropolitan, cosmopolitan class, which feels more European. But if you go outside of the capitals, to the places where things are not nearly as rosy, you'd get a very different set of vox pops. In Britain, for example, 17.5 million people voted to leave the European Union, although the politicians are doing their best to thwart that. But the thing that came out of that discussion to me was also how class-based these opinions are. If you're a Norwegian tourist, you've probably got a few krona. If you are a Portuguese tourist in London, you've probably got a few escudos, or euros as they are now. But of course, if you are unable to travel to any of these places because you've lost your job and because you're really struggling to pay your rent, which has continually risen, the EU looks very different. Labour, Matt Turner, is hoist on this, isn't it? Because most of the Labour Party members in Britain think like that. But most of the Labour Party's voters don't necessarily think like that. At least 70% of the Labour-held constituencies in the British Parliament voted to leave the European Union.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's been a really, really fine balancing act for Labour ever since the referendum result. I mean, they have tried their hardest, and I think they did succeed in the last election of kind of balancing the metropolitan London-based Remainers and the more industrial heartlands, which overwhelmingly voted Leave. And they've done that by being kind of very non-committal on it. You know, they've made the right noises to different kind of subsects of their membership and their voter base, and people's own kind of confirmation bias has kind of said, oh, I think they're on my side. You know, that's a positive thing. I'm going to vote for them. But that can only work for so long, especially as
you have to get off the fence eventually, don't you?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think my recommendation for them would be, I mean, a lot of the arguments posited by Remainers and people who want a second referendum is the economic argument. You know, it's going to be bad for Britain's economy. But what I would say to people on the left is, ironically, that's a very Thatcherite position to take. You know, how it works out for the balance sheet, instead of how people actually voted for themselves and their communities. Yeah.
Fra Hughes, you're from Ireland, albeit the British occupied part, but you are a political man. You're running in the elections. You come from a country where there is a populist party, Sinn Féin, which is left-wing to some people, right-wing to others, liberal in some places, conservative in others. How much of this discussion about Italy and Europe in general do you recognise?
Well, George, I've been very impressed by a lot of the stuff that I've heard so far, and I agree with a lot of the contributors. For me personally, it's always about neoliberal austerity. I can understand populism from actually listening to the two sides of the debate, because in essence, both people are right, but maybe coming from a different perspective. They've both identified that it's the abandonment of the working class and the people of no property and the people who don't have a huge stake in society. The people of 0-hour contracts and 16 hours a week, people on universal credit, which is going to destroy civil society. So I think this is being replicated all the way across Europe, and I totally agree that what's happened is that the people have been abandoned by the elite, by the leaders, by the people who have promised people a land of milk and honey, have actually given us homelessness, despair, food banks, people being put out of their homes and losing their, the mortgages that people have been trying to pay. So I think the people have been abandoned by this elite class, and they've looked for an alternative. And in some places, Jeremy Corbyn is the obvious alternative, because socialism to me is the antidote to capitalism, and to put people before profit, and to put society before the elite few.
And yet the people who stood in Italy on an explicitly socialist platform are, even with the aid of proportional representation, were effectively wiped out, annihilated. So that doesn't apply in other countries, does it?
No, because what will happen is the people obviously maybe don't trust those people, or it's an older... you said yourself that maybe you've not moved to the right wing over years, but you've seen more and more of people moving towards the centre, or some type of societal base where people have come together thinking that the old paradigms of left and right no longer exist, because we must grow politically as individuals the way society has. So society's changed from the Second World War, it's changed from the 60s, it's changed from the 90s, it's changed from the actual collapse through the financial misregulation from the banks. So we're kind of playing catch up, and people are trying to come together to find a new way forward. So you mightn't have a complete right and a complete left. What you might have is what we're seeing, this form of populism, which I think you've referred to before as sometimes taking the worst of both sides and putting them together in order to appeal to the mass of people. But the real litmus test will be when these people are actually put into power, because they haven't been held back by transgressions of the past. So I thought of Syriza when I was listening to this conversation earlier on. As soon as they get into power,
leftist party, yes,
absolutely. As soon as they get into power in Greece, what happened? They were told by the IMF, by the international banking system, by Europe, the same way you were talking about the communists not being allowed into government in Portugal. So you can have all the populism you want as an untested, untried outsider within the political establishment. But once you go in there and you actually have your hands metaphorically, physically, and financially tied behind your back, it's a completely different game.
Dr. James, where do you stand on all this? How do you see the developments that we're discussing here? I must tell you that I never quite understood why the word populist had such a bad name. It sounds like kind of quite a good idea to me to be popular. Go ahead.
Well, I think it is. It's obviously a growing movement, and it's resulted from the left-right stance that politicians have taken rather artificially. For example, but it's changed. But that's changing too. And one example from Italy is Berlusconi has advanced the idea of a Marshall Plan for Africa. Now, that's a much more positive approach to this business of immigration than saying we don't want any more, or trying to keep people out, and whining about the effect of large numbers of people coming in on jobs and house prices and so on. If it was feasible, I don't think actually Italy could do this, but Europe could. I think the Commission...
I doubt if the Italians, forgive me, Father, would be contributing too much to this Marshall Plan.
That's what I mean. I agree about that, but it's a good idea in principle.
They don't even pay tax to the Italian state.
Well, the point is that the Commission have been, I know some of the commissioners, and they've been going around the world, not only Africa, trying to help people in situ in order to reduce their incentives to come to Europe where it's easy and well off. So I think that movement, if that idea could be presented to people as a positive way forward, as a way of protecting their position, and at the same time not garnering the unfortunate label of racism and xenophobia, because it's not that. It is just a matter of volume, in my view, volume and economic pressure. That would be very positive and useful. And can I just say one more thing? The overall plan that Europe is suffering under with the immigration was hatched in 1947, after the Second World War. And it's a plan called the Coudenhove-Kalergi Plan, which actually talks about reducing the European cultural milieu. In other words, allowing or even encouraging other groups of people to come into Europe in order to make it more governable by the elite.
Well, controversial stuff, of course.
I've got it here if you don't believe it.
I never doubted that you would have it, but the fact that I've never heard of it
have you not?
Tends to persuade me that it's not necessarily seminal to developments in European politics, but then you and I usually disagree on that. The overarching point, Patrick, is that our Italian member of parliament, for example, said that his party was proposing giving citizenship to 1 million of the unfortunates who have flooded into Italy, and then he was a bit surprised that his party did so badly. I'm not remotely surprised by that. Are you?
No, I think it's a bit tone deaf, maybe, as to what the overall public opinion is on the ground. I think that there's no way of getting around the fact the European Union has completely bungled the migrant crisis. I mean, there were a million ways you could deal with it, and they've definitely picked one of the wrong ways of doing it, I'm afraid. I don't think initially it was with the worst intentions in mind. I don't think Angela Merkel's this inherently evil human being that wants to destroy a continent or endanger people. No, I just think it was ill thought through. I think you have two pretty obvious solutions. I would say either more prevention at source, or if you do what they've done, then massively boost your infrastructure to be able to cope with it. They've done neither of those two things, and the consequences of that have been massive public disenfranchisement. And also it's been quite dangerous because you see people that have become massively disillusioned with the project when they get here, and they get very angry and they kick off. So no, I don't think the citizenship thing is correct, as our Italian friend said. It was earlier. I don't think it is at all. I've been to refugee camps. I've been to refugee camps on the Syrian border, and they do really kind of want to go home one day. They do want it to all be sorted out, and they do want to go back. I think permanently displacing people is not the right solution.
Well, my grandparents came from Ireland, and they so didn't want to that they spent the rest of their lives crying about it. Usually when they'd taken alcohol at New Year time. They never forgot that they were, in fact, Irish. They never forgot the fact that a very large number of Scottish people didn't actually want them there, and neither did they want to be there. But they came for food. They came because of economic pressures. And of course, got quite disillusioned, as you've just been touching on. It must be better to, and I may say, again, forgive me, Father, Italy has made a rod for its own back here. Italy was one of the most belligerent powers destroying Libya, which destroyed the gate through which so many of these people now landing in Italy are coming. The very Berlusconi who makes such a song and dance. Father, have I introduced you? Please.
If I understand it correctly, you're blaming Berlusconi, but when Italy joined NATO, and as we know, it was actually France and Britain, it was Sarkozy who was actually put up to it by this bogus court philosopher, Marco Levi, and then Cameron, they decided to bomb Libya. Berlusconi was not in power at the time. And I remember something which Gaddafi said, which again, we're talking about racism. He said while Tripoli was hammered by NATO bombers, said, if you do not stop, I will turn Europe black, he said. And that was, but when Berlusconi was in power, Berlusconi made a deal with Gaddafi.
So did Sarkozy.
It was Sarkozy.
He was quite generous, Gaddafi, to President Sarkozy, which was repaid with his own blood.
So Berlusconi, you can blame Berlusconi for everything, for the girls, for embezzling money, but not for Libya, I'm afraid. And I mean, had Berlusconi been still in power, probably Italy would have been less likely to join in the NATO adventure.
I stand corrected. We'll be back right after this. You're watching Kalima Horra. This is the last segment, so let me press on through the audience to get other points of view. Yes, the distinguished-looking gentleman in the middle. Go ahead, sir.
Hello again, George. Since your great success in Bethnal Green, when you wiped out the Labour Party there, and I was, of course, supporting Respect, which was a splendid name for a necessary party. My name's Colin Becks. I am the moderator for Direct Action and External Affairs of the Wessex Regionalists Party. I don't know how many people here would have even heard of us. We've only been going for 42 years, and we're not allowed, you're not allowed to know about us. I come from this, from the direction of what I would say is biological science. In other words, I look at the land of Britain and the land of Europe, and I see regions. And I know from a book by Leopold Kohr called The End of Nationhood, or that's not his title, but that was the subject, that the nation-state model died in around the 50s, close to the end of the Second War. I've been campaigning, I've stood 8 times for Parliament, twice against Cameron, and the interesting thing for psephologists is that I got 110 votes, which was nearly 80% more than my initial stance against Cameron in 2010, and on the platform of 12 candidates, I was standing plumb in the middle, as I'm sitting plumb in the middle here. What I'm trying to say is that never before, over the 42 years I've been fighting, has the opportunity been for the public to stop voting for the war criminals who have been running this country into the ground systematically all my life. And now is the time where a very small vote is close to a tipping point, which will attract a rainbow parliament with coalitions. The first thing I would do, for example, would be, if I were elected, I would introduce a private member's bill setting up the regional parliaments for England. And in that case, we would also have an end of crown supremacy. The crown would be in the parishes. The flow of power would go from the bottom to the top. So anyone who stands for election at the parish level will do what they say they do, or they're out immediately. They would go to the county level, because we would restore the old traditional county boundaries of the first millennium, more or less. There'd be subtle differences. And then they would go ultimately to the regional parliament, and that parliament, by subsidiarity, would do what it was mandated to do, or those people would be out.
Well, fascinating. I don't know, the people watching this across the Arab world will know about the Wessex Regional Party, but they do now. Let's finally hear from the people on the streets of London. Let's take another of these vox pops, shall we?
Do you think that if Italy and the UK leave the EU, other countries will follow as well?
Yes, I think all the countries will follow.
Definitely not Germany. I think there seems to be a few countries that stick together in the EU.
Once one leaves, people will start to follow and realise that it is better, but for some places it's not going to be, like here.
Yes, I think they will. I know in Spain right now, Catalonia is looking for independence of just Spain as the country. So I think the movement is coming and people are wanting more independence and to rely less on the union, but don't realize the impact that it might have.
It's possible. It just depends. Will people realise the value of the EU, or will they just get excited by this idea of countries and sovereignty and just kind of fall victim to kind of the propaganda basically from nationalist parties, I think.
And do you think that Silvio Berlusconi is going to come back to power at some point?
I have no idea.
I think yes, that he's going to get the power again.
Do you think that Berlusconi will come back to power anytime soon?
I couldn't tell you. I'd be really surprised if Italy just had anything to do with him again, because he's such a crook. But, you know, anything goes since Donald Trump was elected.
No, I think Berlusconi is like a reality show. He appears and goes, he appears and goes. So I think there is a happy phenomenon in Italy. And after Renzi, I hope that someone with credibility will come again.
Just for those who are wondering what all those flags were in the centre of London, these are the flags of the so-called British Commonwealth, the former British Empire. 2.5 billion people with a common dream of getting their stolen goods back from the British Museum. Now, let's take the young man at the back. We haven't been to the back benches yet. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Joshua Megan from Battersea. Unfortunately, I don't hold as high-profile a title as the gentleman in the front row, but still, I hope my opinion can in some way be validated by some of the people in the front audience. Obviously, there's going to be disagreements. Yes, I think that one thing that defined Brexit very differently to the way it defines Italy's failing relationship with the EU is that in Britain, it was the younger and supposedly, inverted commas, more left-wing demographic segments of British society that wanted to remain in Europe, and the more right-wing and older demographics, supposedly, again, emphasis on supposedly, that wanted to leave the EU. But this is where I think that support for leaving the EU is an even graver threat to the EU in Italy than it is in Britain, because in Italy, due to the high youth unemployment, partially, it's actually Euroscepticism is coming from both the young and the old stratas of Italian society, and that is what is giving these left-wing movements like Five Star, well, in some respects it's left-wing anyway, this is what's giving them their weight. And this is why I think, and I make this prediction, that at some point during the next decade, Italy will leave the European Union, or at least we will see one Mediterranean country where the economy is also faltering, like in Greece, from Syriza, and from on the opposite end of the political spectrum, Golden Dawn. Pressures from those two diametrically opposite parties that both share a common goal demonstrate that Euroscepticism in the Mediterranean is coming from both the left and right, and for that reason there's going to be an even graver threat to the EU presents itself in that part of Europe. Absolutely.
Dr. Foster, it is, I think, a truth not yet evident that virtually no country in the European Union could risk offering their people the in-out referendum that we had in Britain. Perhaps not even Germany, which, as the public have already recognized, is the major beneficiary of the European Union, and indeed maybe that was always intended to be the case. But I hold that no country could safely hold an in-out referendum because the risk of their people voting to leave is too high. What do you think?
With the Brexit referendum, we have to remember, first of all, that Britain had very unique status within the European Union. We opted out of basically most of the EU's legislation and agreements.
Including the single currency, for example.
Exactly, and the freedom of movement. With the Brexit referendum, it wasn't so much...
No, we had freedom of movement. That was the problem.
With the Brexit referendum, it wasn't so much a vote concerning whether or not Britain should be part of the EU. The Brexit referendum was called in order to kill off UKIP and try and bring voters back to the Conservatives.
UKIP being the overwhelmingly Euro-hostile...
Exactly, the newcomer Eurosceptic party, and it backfired quite spectacularly for the Conservatives, as we know. So having a referendum in a country like Britain would be very different to having a referendum in a country like Italy or Greece, which are part of the Eurozone and much more closely attached to Europe. Now, the question of other referendums coming up, it's something that was being trumpeted in the immediate aftermath of Brexit by people like Marine Le Pen, by Geert Wilders, by Viktor Orban. They've now abandoned that rhetoric. As we saw in the Czech Republic in December, when the ANO party, a very Eurosceptic movement, swept to power, they quickly dropped the idea of a referendum as well. Now, there are different analyses as to why this has happened. One that convinces me is that other European leaders, Eurosceptic or not, look to Brexit and the debacle that both the UK and the EU are making of it and think they don't want that debacle, and also they don't want a close split between their populations. We had a very close minority on one side of the vote. If that was to happen in other countries, we could see more polarity and hostility between them. To go back to the gentleman's question on the youth vote, it's an interesting paradox because as much as the British media framed Brexit as being old and old Eurosceptic, young Europhilic, that wasn't the case. The various analyses that are coming out are showing that there's only one real correlation, and that's urban or small town and rural, where the big cities voted for Remain and the small towns and the countryside voted for Leave. The age demographic doesn't seem to be as significant as we think. But what we're seeing across Europe, in Italy, in Greece, in Germany and Poland, is young people who are throwing their weight behind Eurosceptic movements, because for the young generation, the European Union is no longer the alternative to the status quo being war, Soviet invasion. The European Union was an alternative to that. Now for them, the European Union is the status quo, and they associate it with unemployment, with not being able to get a mortgage, with having astronomical debts that they can't hope to pay off. So there is this curious paradox whereby we would think that young people have the most to benefit from being in the EU, but increasingly they are turning against it because they associate it with an outdated system. Now, the European Union is only half formed. It was founded in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, not because of some conspiracy about repopulating Europe, but in order to prevent another war from breaking out between European nations. It had to be undemocratic in order to work. We don't vote every time the Bank of England wants to change the interest rate, because what do we know about it? So it had to be undemocratic, it had to be run by experts. But after the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, it took on the powers of a state rather than the powers of an economic bloc. And suddenly having state power but not democratic legitimacy means that it's halfway formed. It can't survive in its current form, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to collapse. There is still a potential for it to reform.
It could go forward or it could go backwards. For example, there are many people, myself included, I'm quite happy to be in a European trading bloc. I just don't want to have a European state, least of all one that I can't be allowed to vote for because it wouldn't work if I did. That's a monstrosity for me. I think for many millions of people, the idea of living under rules and an approach that other people are setting when I didn't elect them and cannot remove them.
There are two ways for the European Union to go. One is to go backwards to the European Economic Community of the 1970s and the 1980s, which wasn't perfect, but it largely worked, as it didn't have the powers of a state. But it's very difficult to unmake history, and that would be depending on European commissioners voting themselves out of a job in order to go backwards. That's not going to happen. The only other option is for Europe to become even more European, to concentrate even more powers in Brussels with a democratically elected government.
What could possibly go wrong with that? Finally, Reverend Frank Gelli, Italy traditionally takes a while to form a government. In fact, like some other European countries, Belgium, for example, just set a world record of not having a government at all, I think for well over a year, maybe even more than that. When will Italy form its government, and who will that government be?
You're asking me to be prophetic. I'm afraid amongst my innumerable gifts, I do not have the gift of forecasting the future.
You were the man in the audience most likely to have.
Yes, I could go on about that, but I think I will spare you that. But to some extent, it depends on the president, Mr. Mattarella, to what extent he is proactive, to what extent he has a strong hand in persuading, because the previous president was far more forceful in trying to bring people together, for different parties together. Mattarella is far more hesitant, so the whole thing is in the pipeline. It's impossible to say. But I only want to say something. I'm not so sure the young people in Europe are become so anti-EU, because many have benefited from it. For example, on the famous Erasmus scholarship system, many students, universities, can get a stint of several months paid in another European country to learn the language.
But then we're back to class, you see.
No, but wait a minute, no.
Half the young people in Spain are unemployed.
I have a counter-argument.
Erasmus might as well be on the moon.
I have a counter-argument. There is a special scholarship which the EU gives to some parts, certainly from the south of Italy, traditionally more or less developed, where students, these are high school students, not high college, not university students, who can actually do stints here in the UK, paid, and they go to School of English, and then they go have tours, tourist tour paid for. Some of them have a stint in charity shops and so on. And actually, because one of the hats I wear is actually leading around some of his groups. And so they do exist, and they do benefit from it.
Well, frankly, in my view, that's fiddling while Rome burns. The reality is half of the young people in Spain are unemployed. Nearly half of the young people in Portugal are unemployed. 30%, nearly a third of your own Italian young people are unemployed. I'm afraid a job in a charity shop in England or an Erasmus scholarship.
They learn language. They go to learn English.
We have, if I may close with an English phrase, that won't butter many parsnips. Good luck to the translator who has to convey that to our Arabic audience. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra. You're watching Al Mayadeen Television.